Welcome back to the second part of this data table component that we're building. The video was getting too long, so I decided to break it down even more. We're going to be continuing in this class where we left off, and now that we've got the data that we need to work with, we can then start building out our table. So you can imagine you've worked with HTML tables before, you know what it looks like, but I'm going to provide you guys with a quick mock-up or a quick markup of what an HTML table looks like and how we're going to manipulate it with our data. So do a quick markup. I'm going to echo. It's going to be table, the closing tag, and it's got an head, it's got a closing tag, we got a row, the closing tag, and we've got some th elements in, and this is where we define stuff like first name, last name, email, etc, etc. So you could have as many as these that's relating to as many columns as you got in your database, or as little as you want. It completely depends on how you want it to look, right? So that's the head. Then you've got the body, a closing tag, if I can type, and that's also got a row of all that data that you want to display, right? So when we're looping table or looping within the body, we want to put this row within the loop, because each row represents a line of data, if you get what I'm saying. And the last bit is going to be the foot, and this pretty much displays what we've got in the head, just lower down on the page. So if you've got a long page, you're scrolling down, you might not know what each column is as you scroll down. The foot is there to help guide you, sort of like to say you're in this particular column. But again, how we're doing it, we're going to make the head and the foot optional. Yeah, the foot also contains the rows and stuff like that as well. So we're going to make the head and the foot optional, so we can show it if we want, or we can disable it if we want. But that's the basic layout of a table, of an HTML table. Let's get rid of that, because that's how we're going. That's what we're building right here. We're going to manipulate those data or those HTML and put the right data in, right? But before we do that, I want to actually create some constants in my abstract data table class, which is this class right here, and I want to define some constants which is going to allow us to manipulate that table even further. So I'm going to create two constants, and the first one's going to be a protected const. It's going to be called table properties. It's going to equal an array, right? And let's start by listing out those key value pairs. So the first is going to be the status, get that in lowercase, status, that's going to equal to a empty string for the time being. Second one is going to be order by, that's also going to be an empty string. Third is going to be the table class, which is going to be set to an array, so we could have multiple class names within the class attribute in our table, right? To set that to an array. And the table ID, set that to an empty string, because you can only have one ID per table. Unlike classes, you can only have one ID, right? The next one is going to be show table thed, and this is the option that's going to allow us to show or hide those header within, or header bit or a footer bit within our table. And the head is going to be set to true by default, and we're going to say show table tfoot, and that's going to be set to false by default. Yeah. The next set we need is before and after, and these are going to be elements that we wrap around our table. So we can set some defaults right here. We can set a default div tag as our opening element, and the closing element is going to be that closing div tag, right? But we can change this out to whatever element that we want to wrap it in out in our application. But this is what is going to be default to these div tags, right? And the next one that I want to create is the next protected constant. I'm going to call that column parts, right? And this is going to match exactly what we've done in our user column. We're going to take these out. I can actually just copy this out, exactly what it is, like for like, and just paste it directly within this, just like that. But we're going to leave these empty. We're going to show columns true by default, and let's set the sortable false by default. Yeah, just like that. So I want to be able to validate that we're passing in the right data. So I'm going to create some functions or create some code block that's going to help us do that. And this attribute is what we can take to override any value we've set within this table properties. And remember, it's coming from, let's close this out, not using these for now, get some bit of space. And remember, it's coming from the constructor within this data table class. We pass it to the parent, right, which is going to come back out right here. So we can say if attribute, we want to say this attribute, which is a property that we've not set, so we can set that protected array attr, initialize it to an empty array. So this attribute equal array merge, and we're going to merge table properties with the attributes. So effectively what we're doing is that if we pass in any attributes, we can override any value that we've set right here, and we're merging that together. So we're saying else, if we've not set no attribute, just return the default. So this attribute equals self table properties, just like that. Let's put a semicolon there. Now I want to iterate over each of these key value pair and make sure that they're of the right data type. So I'm going to create a function that's going to do that, and I'm going to initialize it within this constructor. So I'm going to say for each this attr as key value. I'm going to say if it's not set, this set attributes, we could name it as valid attributes, right? Pass that key in and that value, then we could validate it. And we say this valid attributes key, and pass in those properties, so be self table parts key, just like that, right? Now we're going to create this method, copy it to be a private function, paste it, and this first argument is going to be a string. The second argument is going to be a value because it's of a mixed data type, right? And that's just going to return, well, it's going to be void because it won't return anything. We're just sort of checking that we've got the right data type, and if not, we're going to be throwing exceptions. So the first exceptions I'm going to throw is if the key is empty, we're going to throw that exception. I'm going to say if empty key to throw new, it's going to be a base invalid argument exception. I'm going to pass in a message that says invalid or empty attribute key, right? So I'm going to say ensure the key is present and of the correct data type. I'm going to pass that value back in. So I'm going to concatenate that value into this throw statement. Right? Now I'm going to switch through the different option that we've provided and ensure that it complies with what we want it to comply with. So I'm going to show a switch statement to switch between the keys. I'm going to make multiple cases. I'm going to say case. I'm going to say status. I'm going to say case. I'm going to say order by. To say case. To say table ID. Say case. Say before. Say case. Say after. And all I want to do is check that whatever value we put in there is a string, right? So I'm to say if it's not a string, to throw an exception. If the value is not a string, I'm going to throw that exception, yeah? Throw new, and so next base invalid exception. And we're simply going to say invalid argument type to pass the value in of the type that they've supplied. To say value, I'm going to say should be a string, right? Just like that. Now I'm going to check for the Boolean values. So I'm to say case, be show table t-ed case show table t-foot, and I'm going to break. I'm going to copy this throw statement right here because it's going to be pretty similar, and all I'm going to say is if it's not a Boolean or a bool, going to throw an exception just like that, and then change that to Boolean, right? Then the last one is going to be that table class. I'm going to check that it's an array because that's what we set it as, an array. So we're going to say if it's not an array, and that's going to be value, then again throw that exception, and let's change that to array, right? Just like that. Then we want to say this attribute index equal that value, just like that, just like that. Now we're going to come back to our data table, and we're going to start building out our table. So the first thing I want to do is I want to use the PHP function called extract, and let's get the official meaning of what this function is doing. It says import variables into the current symbol table from an array. So effectively I'm going to pass in this attribute, which is what we've assigned down here. These attributes, we've assigned them, we've merged it right here, or else we're returning the default. So I want to extract those variables out so I can use them in a nicer way. For example, without the extract function, I'd have to do something like this attr before, get the values like that. But with the extract function, I can simply just say before, yeah, and that will return the value. So it's a bit cleaner, and we're going to go with this option. To create a next property up here, it's a protected string, and it's going to be element. Set that to an empty string. So we're going to say this element concatenate. I'm going to say before. So right away we're getting that opening tag that we're going to wrap our table in. That's the opening tag right here, semicolon. You can see we concatenate it with that dot because we already initialize it as an empty string up top. So we're just going to go straight into concatenating each of these elements together to build our table. So the next thing I want to do is check that we've got at least one element within our data columns, which is our user column. Check to make sure that we've got at least one element, or one element mean one array of data in. And we're getting that through this method that we've, or this property that we've set in our create method. This data columns, or we're getting them columns method from that object. So we're going to say if is array, if it's an array, this data column and count data columns is greater than 0, then we've got at least one element. So that let's crack on. We've got something to work with. Now the next option as well, the next property I want to check is our data, if we've got data, because we might have got columns but we've got no data. If we've got no data, then there's nothing to show. And remember, we're getting this data options, which is returning our data from the method that we implemented a while ago. That find with search and paging method is returning this data. So we're going to say if is array again, because that method returned those values as an array. So I'm going to say if is array, this data options and this data options isn't null, meaning that we've got some data, then we're going to start building out our table. Right? So we're checking that we've got data, we're checking that we've got at least one element within our column, then we're going to start construct those HTML for our table. So we're going to say this element concatenate table. So I'm going to say table, just like that. I'm going to put the closing tag element concatenate table. Now I'm going to break this down into different methods, so I'm not building out this entire table in this one method, so that it's a little bit more readable and you can understand it a little bit more. So I'm going to use some of the attribute that we've created around there, and I'm going to populate that table with the table class and the table ID. So I'm going to say ID, I'm going to check if we've got an ID set, and if we've got one set, we're going to return it, else just leave it blank. So to say if is it, say table ID. So if we've got a table ID set, let's use it, table ID, else just an empty string, just like that. Now we need to tackle our class. So we've got class, and remember, we can't do it the same as we just did a while ago with the table ID, because our class is returning an array. Unfortunately, we've got a function in PHP that helps us to return that array as strings. So we're going to say, so we're going to implode each item within that table class array via a space. So we're going to put a space as the first argument, and then we're going to pass in table class, which is what we've defined right here, right? So we're going to implode all these classes or all these values that we put in here, and we're going to space them out via space, or implode them via space. And that would be a valid HTML, right? So now we've created our table, our opening table tag on our closing table element, I should say. Let's now start building the head section. And this is one of those sections I'm going to put into a separate method, so it's a little bit more readable, right? So I'm going to concatenate it to this element. So this element concatenate. Remember what I was saying. I want to make this hidable, so you can hide it or you can show it. So I'm going to say show table TED, right? So we're saying if that is set to true, then show the table ed, which I'm going to render in a separate method. I'm going to call that table grid TED, just like that, right? Else, just return nothing. Then we're going to pass in a couple of arguments that we need, and the first is going to be status, and I will get back to that in a minute. Now let's create this method outside of this function. Be public. Let's make it private because it won't be used anywhere else. Private function. I'm going to call it table. Let's just copy it, paste it, and the first argument status is going to be a string. So there's type int it to string, and it's going to return a string, right? So we need to build that ed section of our table, and I'm also going to pass in a second argument, which is because I only want to use this one method to build the header section of our table on the footer. Rather than creating two methods, I can actually do it using one method. So I can actually change the name of this and say table grid. Let's call it elements, just like that. So we're sort of like giving it a neutral name that's going to represent both header and footer for a table. Let's call it that. And we're going to pass in a second argument, and that's going to be a boolean. So I'm going to say bool, and I'm going to say input, just like so. I'm going to default that to false, yeah, just like that. So based on where we're using this particular method within this table method, we're going to set the second argument to true or false, and we want to change the order, and we want it to change whether it's going to be in the head or within the foot. I'm going to create a variable called element to equal to printf, and we've used this function before. And we're going to say open bracket, placeholder, close bracket right there. And all we're going to do is going to say input. So if we're using it as the footer, we're going to say t foot else t ed, just like that. So if we set input to true, it's going to spit out this within these tags right here, and that's just the opening bit. So let's create the closing part of that actual element, table element, and to be printf again, and you can imagine it's going to be similar. So we're going to say closing tag, placeholder, greater than sign, and again I'm going to say input say t foot and t ed, just like that. Now we're going to build the elements that's going to be in between, right? So to the element, get that row, it's going to be tr, the element to that closing tr tag, right? I will need to do our for each loop in between these table rows. So we're going to say for each this data columns. So we're looping over our data columns as column, right? Now we want to actually check, if I take you back to the column, we want to check if we're showing that column. If that column is set to true, we want to do something. If it's set to false, we don't want to show the column. So let's deal with that bit. I'm going to say if is it column show column and column show column isn't false, then let's build that column out. right? And we're not going to put an else statement. Just if it's not enabled, just don't show it. That's it. So, but if we're showing it, we want to build it out. So we're going to say element th element closing tag, just like that. I would simply just want to pass that column. I want to pass in that DT row, which is going to be put a semicolon, which is going to be whatever value we put in this DT row. You can see this first one's got ID, the second one's got first name, but we can change these to whatever we want, right? That's pretty much the table head and table footer bit of our data table. I was simply just going to return the element, which is all strings, right? And we've passed that in already, and we just need to pass in the second argument, or leave it as it is because it already default to false, and we're in the head, so it will not show. It will show the T head. We'll come to implement it below the T body. Then we're going to set that second argument to true, and it's going to swap these around to T foot. So now let's create the body section of our table. So we're going to drop down below this function, and we're going to say this element and concatenate the body, which is going to be T body. I'm going to create that closing tag as well. Just like so. So within this, we need to iterate. We need to do some for each loop. We're going to loop over our data option. We're going to also loop over our sort or show columns. So let's start with our data options. To say for each this data options as row, right? Then I'm going to build that table row. So I'm going to say this element is going to be tr, and let's also create that closing tag. This element tr, just like so. And within this table row, we need to do our next for each loop, which is going to be looping over our columns. So it's going to be for each this data columns as column, just like that. And remember what I'm saying, if we're hiding the table head, we also need to hide the data within that column. This is what we're doing right here, right? So we want to say if isIt column show column and column show column isn't false, then let's do something. Let's close this down for a bit, get a bit more space. Now we can build out our table cell or our data cell, right? So we're going to say this element data cell, which stands for TD. Say this element closing tag, just like so. And we can pass a class to this actual data cell, so we can give it some class, so we can modify it via CSS to look a certain way or to append background colors or whatever. So we're going to say class, and that class is going to be coming from this class within our user column array, and it's just a string, not like the table class. And not like a table class where we're asking for an array. This is just a string. So we're going to pass that straight in, and that's going to be coming from columns and say class, just like that. Now, I want to also check if we're modifying the data through this formatter option, right? That's going to be calling a callback function, or you can refer to it as a closure, which we're going to use to return a different variant of the data that we're pulling in. So all we're going to do that is I'm going to say if is callable, column formatter, meaning that if we set it as a function, then we can call it back, right? So I'm going to say this element concatenate call user func array, right? I'm going to pass in that function name, which is column formatter. Now we also need to pass in a second argument as an array, and I want to pass in the data that we're getting back from our data option, which is this row, right? So I'm going to pass in row for the time being. We're going to come back to this method and pass in other option that we're going to need, but for the time being, we're going to pass in the data row. So we now got access to that data within this array, right? So if we've got the formatter, if we're reformatting the data, let's call that function else just this element concatenate, which is say if isIt row, which is within our data option for each loop, row column db row. So if we've got that row defined within our columns array db row right here, then we're going to say display the data from a database that matches that column. So column db row, just like that. I'm going to say else just do nothing, just like that. And that's pretty much our table complete, right? That's all the data that's going to display our table on within our Twig template. But before we go, also need to implement this at the bottom. So copy it, and below this T body we can paste it down. We can change this to T foot and set the second argument to true, just like that. And that will give us the option to display the table columns in the footer as in the header as well, right? And we've only created one method that's going to do that for us. Now we also need to work on our sortable columns, because you notice that I've only just passed in the row, but what if we need to make that column sortable? We need to implement that within this particular method, and I'm going to delegate it to a next method that's going to implement all of our sortable items, our sortable columns. So I'm going to take this out and I'm going to reference a next method. Let's call this table sorting. I'm going to pass in the columns, which is from that for each loop. I'm going to pass that in. I'm also going to pass in that status. Close that. And this status is coming from our attributes. So if I take it back to my abstract data table, whatever we put into this within our application, when we come to use this table within our application, whatever status we've put in here is what's going to be filtered down into this this variable right that we've defined. It's coming from that attributes array that we've defined within this abstract data table class, just so you know where this status is coming from. Again, we could have defined it like this, or this attribute, but as I'm saying, we're using that extract method, that extract function, which allows us to just use the array as variables like so, right? So we need to create this table sorting method. Let's do that down here. Yeah, next private method, because it won't be used anywhere else. Paste that in, and the first argument is going to be an array of that column, and the second is going to be a string of that status, right? Let's put comma. And that also is going to be returning a string, just like so. So the idea behind the table sorting is that we want to make certain columns clickable, so meaning that it's wrapped around an anchor tag, which we can then set to sort that particular column in an ascending or descending order. Or we can sort by any column name within our database table that we've defined. So that's the idea behind this. We're going to be using query parameters that we're going to be attaching to our URI to actually help us to query the database via what we've clicked, right? So that's the idea behind the sorting. So I'm going to build that out, and you can see exactly what it looks like. So I'm going to say if it column and sortable and column sortable isn't false. Yeah, so what we're saying is in our user column, if that is set to false, then it's not sortable. If it's set to true, we're going to make this column, or we're going to wrap it around an anchor tag and put the relevant query status in to actually perform the operations that we need this column to operate, right? So I'm going to say if is column sortable and sortable is set to false, then do nothing, right? But if it's set to true, we need to recreate it. We need to wrap it around an anchor tag and set some query variables or some query parameters. So to say element, and it's going to be equal to opening anchor tag, to say href, and I'm going to next element at the bottom with the closing portion of the anchor tag, just like that. Now in between that is where I want to return that DT row. So element concatenate column DT row. So we're saying if the table is not sortable, let's just return the DT row as normal with no element wrapped around it. So element concatenate column DT row. All right, and remember we're passing this all the way within this table head in this method right here, wrapped around these th elements, right? And that's just going to return those elements like so. So by default, I'm going to be using a theme or a CSS framework called UIKit. It's similar to Bootstrap and all the other CSS frameworks out there, but this is my preference, is what I'm going to wrap these elements in. And the idea behind creating components or a class like this is that we can change these out to a Bootstrap variant or a Foundation CSS variant, whatever. But by default, I am going with the UI kit. So I'm going to be using UI elements or UI class elements within this particular data table. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a class attribute. I'm going to set it to UK link reset, and this is a class, and what this does is sort of like formats that link to make it look like the other elements within that table, like color wise, and it removes that underline from the link that you normally get, right? So that's what that class does. And within this href, there's a couple of stuff that we need to do, and I'm going to write it in and then explain to you what it's doing. So I'm going to say if the status is not empty, then let's add that status or append that that status parameter to the URI. So to say status, create some empty string, to say question sign, status, that's going to equal whatever the status is that we've set, right? Then we're going to append the column name that's going to be coming from our column DB row. So whatever we've set as DB row in here is what we're going to refer to as column. So we can sort by email, status, created at, and that's going to be coming from the DB row right there. So we're going to append the order onto that. So I'm going to say and order, and that's going to be coming from a property that we've created up here, which is going to be that sort direction, right? So I'm going to say this sort direction, just like so. So we're saying if we've got a status, append that parameter to the URI. Else, if there's no status, let's go with the column that we're sorting by. I'm going to say and column equal column DB row, right? And we need to add the order equal this sort direction, just like so. Yep, and save it just like that. So what's this error we're getting down here? Undefined variable. Right, so let's just concatenate that and let's reset that variable. Element empty string, and that should clear that up just like that, right? And that's pretty much all we're going to define our sorting. We're going to come back and modify this and change the behavior depending on, depending if it's doing what we want. But we can only do that, or we'll come to visualize testing it. And the next bit that I want to add in, actually, before I forget, is those sorting icons, because they're going to be icons that's going to point up or down to show you what order we're sorting in. And I'm going to say element equal, I'm going to use font awesome. And even though font awesome is not part of the UI kit, as UI kit got their own icons, I prefer the font awesome icon for this particular scenario. So all we use font awesome, they use the italic tags. We say I open and close, and I'm going to pass in a class that says class is FAS F sort. Now I can't hard code this bit because I need it to be dynamic, and that's why we've got all these values up here that we've defined. That's going to help us to do that, right? So back down here to concatenate those dynamic properties on. So I'm going to say this that table column. So like table column equal column DB row, then we're going to concatenate an hyphen, and we're going to put the direction. This, and all this direction property does is return either up or down, and that's going to be based on the current sorting of that particular column, right? Else, just do nothing, return an empty string. So that's how we're going to apply the icon to our sortable column, up or down, based on the current sort. And that's returning that element. And down in our table, or in our table, we need to return those elements as well, right? Just like that. And we're going to be building out our pagination in the next video, so stay tuned for that one. It's going to be coming up pretty shortly.